The screaming had stopped. That was the worst part. Not the thunder of hooves, not the clash of steel against shield, not the war cries that had shaken the earth for hours. The silence was what broke a man, because the silence meant the dying was done, and the counting had begun. It is the winter of 1241. The frozen plains of Mohi, in the heart of the Kingdom of Hungary, are no longer white. They are red, stained with the blood of nearly 60,000 men. The Sejo River runs dark at its banks. Horses lie still beside their riders. Knights who had been blessed by priests at dawn, who had kissed their crosses and prayed for God's protection, are now piled 3 deep in the mud. Their hauberks, the heavy chainmail coats they wore as armor, have been stripped from their bodies by men who moved between the fallen like shadows, methodical and without mercy. The great royal banners of Hungary, embroidered in gold and crimson, are trampled into the earth. Somewhere in the chaos, a king is fleeing on horseback. King Bela IV of Hungary, once master of a realm stretching from the Adriatic to the Carpathians, rides alone through a frozen forest, pursued by some of the most fearsome cavalry the world has ever seen. His army is gone. His nobles are dead. His kingdom is open. And the men who have done this, they have not lost a single significant battle in over 15 years. This is the Battle of Mohi. This is the Mongol invasion of Europe. And if history had gone only slightly differently on that blood-soaked plain in April of 1241, you might be speaking a very different language today. If you've never heard this story before, you are not alone, and that is precisely why we're telling it. Stay with us, because what unfolded in Hungary over the course of 2 extraordinary days is one of the most consequential and most forgotten military catastrophes in human history. To understand Mohi, we must travel back far east, to the windswept steppes of Central Asia, where, in the late 12th century, a world was being remade by a single man. His name at birth was Temujin. He was born, by most accounts, somewhere along the Onon River, in what is now northeastern Mongolia, around the year 1162. His childhood was defined by poverty, captivity, and betrayal. His father was poisoned by rivals when Temujin was still a boy. His family was abandoned by their clan, left to survive on berries, roots, and whatever small game they could hunt on the open steppe. He was enslaved, escaped, and clawed his way back to dignity through sheer, merciless willpower. By the time he reached adulthood, Temujin had forged alliances, fought wars, and broken the old tribal order of the Mongolian steppe. In 1206, at a great assembly of tribal leaders known as a Kurultai, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. And what followed was the most rapid expansion of an empire in the history of the ancient world. The Mongols were not simply raiders. That misunderstanding has persisted for centuries, and it does a disservice to the reality of what they were, which was something far more frightening. They were a sophisticated military machine. Genghis Khan reorganized his armies on a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors. Promotion was based entirely on merit and loyalty, not birth. Every soldier was a skilled horseman from childhood, capable of riding continuously for days, sleeping in the saddle, surviving on minimal rations of dried meat and fermented mare's milk. They communicated across vast distances using a relay system of horse messengers, the yam, that was faster than any courier network in the known world. Their tactics were studied, refined, and devastating. The feigned retreat, riding away from an enemy as if in panic, then wheeling around and unleashing a storm of arrows when the pursuing troops broke formation, had destroyed armies from China to Persia. The Mongols used psychological warfare as deliberately as any weapon. Cities that surrendered peacefully were spared and often left to govern themselves under Mongol oversight. Cities that resisted were annihilated, utterly, completely, without exception. The lesson was calculated. Resistance is more costly than submission. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but the machine he built did not slow down. His empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, and each of them expanded their territories with the same ruthless efficiency they had been raised on. It was his grandson Ogedei Khan who now sat upon the great throne in Karakoram, and it was Ogedei who, in 1235, gave the order that would bring the Mongol tide crashing against the walls of Europe. The campaign was to be led by Batu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, and by the most gifted general in the entire Mongol Empire, a man named Subutai. If Genghis Khan was the architect of Mongol power, Subutai was its master builder. He was old by 1241, likely in his 60s, heavy-set and perhaps no longer able to ride as he once had. Accounts suggest he traveled in a cart, but his mind was as sharp as the curved sabers his warriors carried. He had already campaigned across Russia, Persia, Georgia, and the Caspian steppe. He had defeated the armies of the Cumans, the Kievan Rus, the Georgians, and the Bulgars. He had never lost a major engagement, and now he turned his attention west. Europe, in 1241, had no idea what was coming. The rumors had reached the ears of kings and bishops. Tales of horsemen from the east, of burning cities, of armies that moved like wind across the plains of Russia. But Russia felt very far away from the comfortable courts of Hungary, Poland, and the Holy Roman Empire. The Mongols were spoken of in whispers, dismissed as savages, or conflated with mythological figures from scripture. Some churchmen believed them to be the lost tribes of Israel, or the forces of Gog and Magog from the Book of Revelation. King Bela IV of Hungary was more alert than most. He had received refugees, tens of thousands of Cuman tribespeople fleeing before the Mongol advance, and he had granted them asylum, settling them in Hungary in exchange for their military service. It was a controversial decision that earned him enemies among his own nobility, who resented the newcomers and their different customs. But Bela understood, at least dimly, that something terrible was approaching. What he could not have understood was the scale of the planning arrayed against him. Subutai had spent years gathering intelligence. Mongol spies had traveled through Poland, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire in the guise of merchants and travelers. They mapped the roads, measured the rivers, assessed the fortifications, and reported back on the political tensions between European rulers. Subutai knew that Hungary and Poland were not unified. He knew that the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II was locked in a bitter quarrel with Pope Gregory IX. He knew that a coordinated European response to a Mongol invasion was essentially impossible. And so, in the winter of 1240 to 1241, the Mongols moved. They came in multiple columns, a stroke of strategic genius that remains studied in military academies to this day. One force, under Batu's brothers Orda and Baidar, swept north through Poland, not primarily to conquer it, but to prevent the Polish armies from reinforcing Hungary. They destroyed Krakow. On the 9th of April, 1241, just 2 days before Mohi, they met the combined forces of Poland and Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Legnica in Silesia. The European forces, despite fighting bravely, were annihilated. Henry II, Duke of Silesia, was killed. His head was reportedly paraded before the walls of the nearby fortress on a lance. While this was happening, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai crossed the Carpathian Mountains through multiple passes simultaneously, pouring into the Hungarian plain from several directions at once. Bela scrambled to raise his army and met the Mongols at the Sejo River, near the town of Mohi. The Hungarian army was not small. Estimates place it at between 60 and 100,000 men, a substantial force that included armored knights, infantry, crossbowmen, and the Cuman cavalry Bela had welcomed into his kingdom. These were veterans of European warfare. They carried the lances, swords, maces, and shields of the medieval West. Their heavy cavalry, knights encased in chainmail, riding armored destriers, represented the most powerful military technology Europe had to offer. And yet, on the night of the 10th of April, the two armies were camped on opposite banks of the Sejo. Bela's commanders believed the river created a natural barrier, a breathing room in which they could observe the enemy and plan. The Hungarian force had drawn its wagons into a lager, a circular defensive encampment bound together by chains, creating what they believed was an impregnable camp. They felt secure. They should not have. Subutai did not sleep. While the Hungarians rested, the old general sent a force in secret downstream to cross the river at an unguarded ford. He himself led this flanking column personally, guiding thousands of men silently through the darkness, across the cold water, to the far side of the Sejo. Meanwhile, Batu Khan's forces would advance directly on the main bridge at Mohi, drawing Hungarian attention and fighting forward. Just before dawn on the 11th of April, the battle began. Batu attacked the bridge with enormous force. The Hungarians pushed back hard. For a time, it seemed as though the defense might hold. Hungarian crossbowmen rained bolts down on the attackers. The fighting at the bridgehead was savage, close, and desperate. Batu himself was nearly killed. Several horses were shot from beneath him. By his own later account, his armor was struck by arrows multiple times. But this was the trap. Every Hungarian warrior drawn to that bridge, every knight who surged forward to defend the crossing, was a man not watching the flank. Subutai crossed with his flanking force and hit the Hungarian army from behind, from an angle they had not imagined possible. Simultaneously, the Mongols at the bridge unleashed an innovation that the Europeans had never encountered on this scale: siege engines, catapults, and, by some accounts, primitive gunpowder-based fire weapons, brought from captured Chinese and Persian engineers. Fire and smoke poured over the Hungarian lines. The noise, the destruction, the sudden realization that the enemy was both in front and behind, it shattered the Hungarian cohesion. A force that cannot react as a unit ceases to be an army. It becomes a crowd, and a crowd can be herded. This too was Subutai's design. As the Hungarians began to break and flee, the Mongols, rather than simply pursuing and killing every man, deliberately left an opening in their encirclement. A gap, a road that appeared to lead to safety. Desperate men, seeing escape, flooded into it. The gap was a corridor of death. Mongol cavalry rode alongside the fleeing Hungarians on both sides, cutting them down with arrows as they ran, for miles. Men threw away their weapons, their armor, their horses. They ran into marshes and drowned. They ran into forests and starved. The pursuit lasted for days. The death toll was catastrophic. Estimates of Hungarian dead range from 40,000 to nearly 70,000. Among the slain were the Archbishop of Kalaksa, the Bishop of Győr, many of the greatest nobles of the realm, and the cream of Hungary's knightly class. An entire generation of Hungarian military leadership was wiped from the earth in a single morning. King Bela fled north, then west, then south, always ahead of Mongol pursuit detachments. He rode to the Adriatic coast, eventually taking shelter on islands off the Dalmatian shore. His kingdom was open. If you found this story as gripping as we have, please consider subscribing to this channel. We cover exactly these kinds of forgotten, world-shaping moments in history that never made it into your school textbooks. And share this video because this story deserves to be known. What followed the Battle of Mohi was not the end of the Mongol advance. It was the beginning of an occupation. Through the summer of 1241, Mongol forces ranged across Hungary. They burned cities. They destroyed crops. The great city of Pest, which would one day unite with Buda to become the Hungarian capital, was razed. Monasteries, villages, fortresses, all fell. Entire regions were depopulated. Archaeological evidence has confirmed mass graves from this period, and Hungarian chronicles describe a landscape of ash and bones stretching in every direction. In the winter of 1241 to 1242, as the Danube froze solid, Mongol cavalry crossed on the ice into the lands of the Holy Roman Empire. The armies of Austria, Bohemia, and the German princes mustered, but there was no engagement. Western Europe trembled. Pope Innocent IV wrote desperate letters begging for a crusade. Frederick II appealed to the kings of England and France. But the responses were slow, the alliances fractured, and the Mongols were already considering their next move. And then, on the 11th of December 1241, Ogidi Khan died in Karakorum. The law of the Mongol Empire required every senior prince and commander to return to the Mongolian homeland for the Kurultai, the great assembly that would elect a new great Khan. Batu Khan, as a senior prince, had to go. Subutai, the architect of every triumph, followed. The advance stopped. The Mongols pulled back from Hungary, crossed the Carpathians, and were gone as suddenly as they had appeared. Europe exhaled, and then, remarkably, immediately began to forget. Why is the Battle of Mohi not taught in Western schools? Why do most people in Europe and the Americas know Gettysburg, Waterloo, and the Somme but have never heard of Mohi? Part of the answer lies in geography and perspective. History, as it has traditionally been written in the West, centers on Western European civilizations. Hungary, in 1241, was a frontier, important certainly, but not the beating heart of the chronicles that would be copied, preserved, and eventually printed and disseminated across centuries. The monks of Paris and London wrote about what happened in Paris and London. Part of the answer lies in the outcome. Europe survived. The Mongols withdrew. Because the catastrophe did not ultimately destroy Western civilization, it receded from memory. Unlike, say, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which shook the entire European world and left an enormous literary and cultural trail. And part of the answer lies in the sheer discomfort of what the battle reveals. Mohi forces us to confront the fact that the military traditions of medieval Europe, the knightly class, the chivalric ideal, the heavily armored cavalry that formed the backbone of every feudal army, were, against the Mongols, essentially helpless. European tactics were built for European warfare. For the charge, the melee, the siege. They had no answer for an enemy that refused to fight that way, that drew them out of formation, maneuvered at impossible speeds, rained arrows from distances at which European archers could not effectively respond, and turned their own momentum against them. The battle demands a reckoning that is, in some ways, more humbling than a simple defeat. It suggests that an entire civilization's way of war was, at that moment in history, fundamentally outmatched. There is one more dimension to this story that we cannot leave untouched, because it belongs to the full accounting of what Mohi cost. The people of Hungary did not simply suffer on a battlefield. The months and years that followed the battle brought famine, plague, and displacement on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Contemporary Hungarian chronicles, most notably the account of a Benedictine monk named Friar Roger, who survived the Mongol occupation and wrote about it in a work called Carmen Miserabile, or The Song of Misery, describe a landscape of complete devastation. Roger wandered through villages where every house had been burned, where the bones of the dead lay unburied in the streets, where survivors subsisted on roots, tree bark, and the flesh of horses. He describes women and children hiding in marshes for months, dying of cold and hunger. He describes the look in the eyes of men who had lost everything, their families, their homes, their futures, and simply sat in the ruins, unable to move. Friar Roger was not a soldier. He was a man of God who had been taken captive, who had escaped, and who had walked through the wreckage of a civilization trying to understand what had happened to it. His account is not a military history, it is a human one. And it reminds us that the numbers we cite, 40,000 dead, 60,000 dead, are not simply statistics. Each one of those numbers was a person who woke up that morning in April of 1241 believing they might survive. Modern historians estimate that Hungary lost perhaps 15 to 25% of its total population as a result of the Mongol invasion, to battle, to massacre, to starvation, to disease. In some regions, the figure may have been higher. It was, in terms of proportional human loss, among the greatest demographic catastrophes in the history of medieval Europe. King Bela IV eventually returned to his kingdom. He found a nation in ruins, and he spent the rest of his life rebuilding it. He constructed hundreds of stone fortresses. The Mongols had found it difficult to take well-defended stone castles, and Bela was determined that if they returned, Hungary would be ready. He repopulated depopulated regions with settlers from Germany and other neighboring lands. He reformed his military structure, investing more heavily in castle networks and less in the kind of massed open-field army that had been destroyed at Mohi. He ruled for another 3 decades, and when he died in 1270, Hungary was recovering, scarred, but alive. The Mongols did return briefly in 1285 under a different leader. This time, Hungary's network of stone fortresses held. The invasion failed. Bela's lesson had been learned in the hardest way imaginable, and it had not been forgotten. Subutai died around 1248 in his native lands, an old man who had campaigned across more geography than almost any military commander in history. He is credited by scholars with directing more than 20 major campaigns and winning over 60 significant battles. He conquered or raided territories across China, Central Asia, Persia, Georgia, Russia, Poland, and Hungary. By most measures, he was the greatest purely military mind of the medieval age, and most people outside of dedicated history circles have never heard his name. Batu Khan established the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that would rule the steppes and exert enormous influence over Russia for the next 2 centuries. His descendants would shape the development of Russian civilization in ways that historians are still fully mapping today. So here we are, nearly 8 centuries later, standing at a distance that allows us to see what those living through it could not. We can see the full scope of what the Battle of Mohi was, not simply a military engagement between two forces, but a collision between two entirely different ways of understanding the world. The settled, agricultural, hierarchical civilization of medieval Europe, and the mobile, meritocratic, ruthlessly efficient empire of the steppe. We can see that Europe's survival was not inevitable. The withdrawal of the Mongols was not the product of European resistance or European valor. It was the product of a political death far away in Central Asia. A different outcome at Ogedi's deathbed, a different succession, and the armies of Batu and Subutai might have continued westward. The great cathedrals of France and Germany, Notre Dame, Cologne, Chartres, might have burned as pest burned. The universities of Paris and Bologna might have been emptied as the libraries of Merv and Samarkand were emptied. The history of Western civilization would have been written differently, or perhaps not written at all. We live, in a very real sense, in the shadow of Mohi, in the shadow of a catastrophe that nearly became something so much worse, and that we have largely chosen not to remember. History has a tendency to honor the survivors, to tell the story of those who persisted, rebuilt, and eventually flourished. The dead of the Seijo River Plain have no monuments that most of the world can visit. Their names, almost without exception, are lost. The chronicles preserved a handful of the great and the powerful, a bishop here, a duke there, but the 40,000 who fell on that April morning were farmers, craftsmen, grooms, priests, sons, fathers. They went to fight for their king and their country and their faith, and they were annihilated by a military system so far beyond their experience that they never had a fair chance. Their story deserves to be told. And so does the story of every human being who survived the months that followed, who hid in the frozen earth, who ate bark and roots, who watched the smoke rising from where their village used to be, and who somehow, impossibly, kept living. They are the reason Hungary exists today. They are the reason we can stand in Budapest and look at the Danube and know that this land endured. Their resilience did not make the history books the way that the charges and the countercharges and the strategic brilliance of Subutai made the history books. But it should. If the story moved you, if you felt the weight of those lives and that forgotten morning on the banks of the Seijo, please leave a comment below. We want to know which battles, which campaigns, which chapters of history you feel the world has overlooked. Your suggestions shape what we make next. Like this video if you believe these stories deserve a wider audience. And subscribe because we are just getting started. The Mongols will return to this channel. There are other battles to fight, other civilizations to understand, other mornings of catastrophe and survival waiting in the archives of history. But for now, let the plain of Mohi be quiet. Let the river run as it will. And let us remember, as best we can, across all these centuries, the ones who fell there, and the ones who somehow did not. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and turn on notification for more documentary stories.